By 146 BCE, Rome had already become the undisputed power in the Western Mediterranean. But to the east, Greece still clung to an illusion that the old city-states, despite centuries of internal rivalry, could resist Roman arbitration as sovereign equals. The reality was harsher, and the failure to face it would lead Corinth to ruin. In the decades leading up to the Corinthian War, the Greek world was increasingly fragmented. Athens, Sparta, Thebes, and especially the Achaean League pursued their own paths. There was no unified strategy, no joint command, and no single diplomatic voice. When disputes arose over territory, trade, or tribute, the Greeks didn't resolve them together. They looked to Rome, and Rome listened. It positioned itself not as a conqueror, but as a protector of minor cities, a subtle but potent shift. By claiming to defend the smaller polis from the larger ones, Rome established a pattern of intervention that eroded Greek autonomy without drawing swords. Corinth, proud and prosperous, saw this as manipulation. But Rome had the leverage. One of those levers was trade. Roman merchants were flooding the Aegean markets, often enjoying better terms than local Greeks. Tax burdens were shifting. Economic asymmetry grew. And while Corinth remained rich with its ceramics, bronze work, and strategic harbor, it was also becoming dependent on a trade system increasingly regulated by Roman law and Roman tariffs. This wasn't a sudden change. According to Polybius, who witnessed many of the diplomatic episodes firsthand, the idea of Roman arbitration became a norm in Greek politics by mid-2nd century BCE. Thessaly and Epirus had already been pacified. Macedonia had been divided into client republics. The precedent was clear. Rome didn't need war. It needed justification. That justification came when the Achaean League, led by Corinth, refused a direct Roman order to expel certain cities from the League under the pretext that they were destabilizing the region. For Rome, this was the final test. An ultimatum was delivered. The rejection of that ultimatum, not just diplomatically, but with open defiance, triggered the invasion. From the Roman perspective, this wasn't just another punitive expedition. It was the enforcement of a model. Resistance to arbitration wasn't merely a Greek problem. It was a threat to Roman authority across the Mediterranean. Letting it pass would invite similar rebellions in Asia Minor, North Africa, even Iberia. For the Greeks, especially the Achaeans, the logic was emotional. To accept Rome's demands would have meant acknowledging vassal status. To refuse, even in the face of overwhelming odds, was for many in Corinth a last assertion of dignity. One young Achaean senator, Democritus, reportedly shouted in the assembly, "We were born free and will fall as such." That line would later be quoted in Roman Senate debates, not with admiration, but as proof of Greek arrogance. Here lies the strategic error, misreading asymmetry as partnership. And so, the final warnings were ignored. The army that would raise Corinth was already in motion. The next question was not whether war would happen, but how Rome would fight it. Once the ultimatum was ignored, Rome moved with precision. The Senate appointed Lucius Mummius to lead the campaign, not as a negotiator, but as an executor. By the time his legions reached the Peloponnese, it was no longer about diplomacy. It was about example. Corinth stood proud behind thick walls and a narrow urban layout that once gave it strategic resilience. The Greeks counted on that. Narrow alleys, fortified gates, defenders who knew the terrain. But what they didn't count on was how efficiently the Roman army had learned to fight in cities. Mummius brought with him a balanced force. 2 legions of heavy infantry, auxiliary cavalry from Numidia, and a contingent of light artillery, mainly mobile ballistae and Scorpios, siege weapons ideal for penetrating dense structures. The Romans didn't encircle Corinth in a slow siege. They struck directly. The assault came after a brief standoff outside the city. According to Appian, the Greek resistance collapsed rapidly once the outer defenses were breached. The Achaean commander, Dias, fled rather than lead the final stand. That moment, a general abandoning the city, sealed Corinth's fate. The urban terrain, which should have favored defenders, became a trap. Roman infantry divided into cohorts and advanced in waves. The ballistae created openings in walls and buildings. Cavalry swept through the open zones behind the first line. What followed was not a prolonged fight. It was a rout. Within hours, the Roman standard flew over the Acropolis. What happened next was deliberate. Mummius ordered the city to be emptied. Men were slaughtered, women and children sold into slavery. Temples were stripped of their treasures, artworks loaded onto Roman ships. Fire consumed what was left. Polybius, who had hoped for a negotiated peace, described the sight with rare bitterness. There was no house untouched by fire, no street left clean of blood. Strategically, this was not excess. It was policy. Corinth was not merely defeated, it was erased. Rome had punished other cities before, but Corinth's destruction was systematic. The message was meant to resonate far beyond Greece. Defy Rome, and your name disappears from maps. A Roman soldier named Gaius Lixius later wrote in a letter, preserved in fragments, that the troops saw the loot as their rightful salary. We took what was owed, he wrote, and what could not be carried, we burned. This speaks to a deeper tactic. Mummius didn't just win a battle. He transformed a military victory into geopolitical deterrence. The logistics also mattered. The campaign was fast because the legions were well supplied, coordinated with naval units from Brundisium and stationed allies in Macedonia. Corinth expected a delay, weeks of Roman buildup. Instead, they faced a force ready to strike immediately. This miscalculation revealed something crucial. The Greeks believed the diplomatic channel would still work. The speed of the Roman invasion shattered that illusion. So, the fall of Corinth was not just a military loss. It was a collapse of confidence in Greek diplomacy. And it posed a darker question. When punishment becomes theater, who is the real audience? The siege of Corinth was fast and brutal, but the road to it was paved not just by Roman steel. It was Greek pride that lit the fire. At the heart of the Achaean League, especially in the years leading up to 146 BCE, a dangerous fantasy took hold. The idea that Greece, fractured but noble, still stood as an equal to Rome. This belief wasn't rooted in military fact or diplomatic reality. It was emotional, anchored in memory. In council meetings, Achaean senators referenced the days of Thermopylae and Salamis. They spoke of partnership, not submission. But that language didn't match their position. Rome had already dismantled Macedon, placed garrisons across Greece, and dictated terms from the Ionian Sea to the Aegean. Still, in the chambers of Corinth, many leaders refused to speak the word inferior. This misalignment was costly. The Senate of the Achaean League made decisions not with cold analysis, but with performative rhetoric. There were speeches about honor, oaths to resist foreign influence, and gestures of unity, even as the League cities bickered behind closed doors. One key voice in this climate was Critolaus, a fervent nationalist who rose to power shortly before the conflict erupted. He called for a Greece of the Greeks, rejecting compromise. But his speeches lacked one thing, a realistic plan to win. And the League followed him anyway. The emotional fuel came not just from leaders, but from the streets. Public gatherings in Corinth were flooded with slogans, ancient symbols, and patriotic songs. Statues were adorned, festivals reframed as moments of resistance. It felt powerful, but it was ungrounded. When Rome issued its ultimatum to remove certain cities from the League, the political class read it not as strategy, but as humiliation. They rallied not to delay war, but to save face. One senator reportedly said, "Better to fall as Greeks than to live as clients." But clients could have lived, and Greece might have negotiated a different future. This pride was not unique to the Achaeans, but reached its peak there. Rome understood this, and Rome didn't attack Corinth just to win. It attacked to wound the Greek sense of self. Lucius Mummius was instructed not only to take the city, but to crush its prestige. That's why the temples were desecrated, the artworks seized, the libraries destroyed. It wasn't just looting, it was cultural dismantling. A Roman observer named Decimus, writing years later, noted that the Greeks believed themselves in the play. They spoke in acts. They died in the final scene. This wasn't entirely wrong. The League's failure was not merely tactical. It was theatrical, a refusal to see the world as it was. When policy becomes drama, strategy dies, and the consequences echoed far beyond the battlefield. What happens when a civilization mistakes its memory for its strength? After the fires died in Corinth, something deeper began to burn, not in the ruins, but in the collective psyche of the Greek world. For the first time, the civilization that once defined knowledge, politics, and art for the Mediterranean had to confront a new reality. It was no longer the center. The fall of Corinth wasn't just a military or political event. It was existential. Cities like Athens and Sparta, though spared the sword, responded not with rebellion, but with silence. Their diplomats offered no protest. Their generals offered no plans. The message was clear. Resistance was no longer noble. It was suicide. This silence was strategic, but was also psychological. Greece, as a cultural force, had never truly been conquered before. Even under Macedonian rule, its identity remained dominant. Now, that identity fractured, artists stopped depicting contemporary themes and returned to myth. Orators quoted Homer more than law. Public rituals that once celebrated civic pride became somber or vanished altogether. It was as if Greece, unable to fight Rome with weapons, began to retreat into memory. And yet, paradoxically, it was precisely this memory that Rome desired. Roman elites, even as they crushed Corinth, were obsessed with Greek culture. They brought back not only statues and scrolls, but teachers, philosophers, artisans. Greek slaves became tutors to Roman nobles. Greek theater influenced Roman drama. Even the gods were renamed, not erased. This dynamic, conqueror as admirer, created a strange relationship. Greece lost autonomy, but gained immortality. Its body was beaten, but its mind was borrowed. Still, for those living through it, the trauma was real. Athenian writer Philostratus, decades later, described the era as one of echoes and ashes. He wrote of children growing up never knowing a free polis, of markets filled with Latin tongues, of temples rebuilt with Roman funds but Greek facades, like masks over wounds. One powerful symbol of this cultural shift was the use of Greek art in Roman triumphs. Statues of Apollo and Athena, once sacred, were paraded in Rome as trophies. What had been gods now served as decoration. The message was brutal. Beauty could not protect sovereignty. There was also the weight of memory. Corinth's destruction didn't vanish from Greek consciousness. On the contrary, it haunted it. Later historians and poets would revisit the event as both warning and wound. A reminder that pride, left unchecked, leads to ruin. That civilization, if not defended with clarity, can be dismantled by those who admire it most. And for the Roman world, it set a precedent. Culture could be preserved and owned without preserving the people who made it. So what remains of a civilization after conquest? Sometimes only the stories. When Corinth fell, a city was erased, but an empire expanded. Rome didn't just crush Greek resistance. It absorbed Greek territory, economy, and prestige into its system. And from the ruins, a new political geography emerged. The region was reorganized as the Roman province of Achaia. While some local institutions remained, real power shifted to Roman governors, backed by legions and answerable only to the Senate. Decisions once debated in Greek assemblies were now reviewed in Latin in provincial capitals. This was no accident. Rome had refined its method: destroy resistance, preserve function, and incorporate territory. Greece was no longer an independent constellation of polis. It was an administrative zone, valuable, beautiful, but no longer sovereign. One of the most immediate changes was economic. Corinth had been a hub of wealth, with its control of trade routes, ports, and artisan industries. After its destruction, that wealth didn't vanish. It flowed toward Rome. Art, gold, manuscripts, even skilled workers were transferred west. Thousands of Greek men, women, and children were sold into slavery. The Roman aristocracy saw the fall of Corinth not only as a military victory, but as an infusion of capital and culture. According to Strabo, the redistribution of Corinthian wealth was so vast that even minor Roman families acquired Greek slaves trained in rhetoric and science. Education itself became a Roman commodity, but Greek in content. Administratively, Rome employed a model of indirect control. Local elites who pledged loyalty were kept in place, given privileges and responsibilities. Temples continued to operate. Greek language endured. But the real decisions, tax rates, military recruitment, legal appeals, came from Roman authority. It was a flexible form of dominance, designed not to erase the Greek world, but to domesticate it. Yet the destruction of Corinth still served a larger purpose, one that extended far beyond the Aegean. Rome needed a warning shot for the wider Hellenistic world. To the east, Pergamon, Syria, and Egypt were still autonomous, still wealthy, still watching. The annihilation of Corinth became a message. Resistance was not only futile, it was terminal. And if a city as rich and proud as Corinth could be turned to ash, so could any other. This wasn't lost on future generations. When uprisings flared in Judea or unrest stirred in Gaul, Roman commanders cited the precedent of Corinth. Total war as theater, punishment as pedagogy. Even culturally, Corinth became a symbol. Roman poets referenced it as a place where hubris met fate. Philosophers pointed to it as a lesson in pride and realism. Greek historians, especially in exile, marked it as the hinge between years. Rome didn't just conquer land, it created templates. So the question remains, was Corinth a unique punishment or the first in a new doctrine? And for those living under Rome, the answer shaped how they obeyed, resisted, or survived.